The ballroom buzzed with idle chatter, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from small groups. Every year, Jonathan Stewart threw an extravagant office party. This year's was no different. The venue screamed wealth, gold accents, towering floral displays, and a bar stocked with the finest liquors. As usual, I felt like an outsider. Tracy, my wife, was in her element. She floated through the room, mingling effortlessly, her red dress hugging her frame in a way that always caught attention. She'd been a part of Jonathan's team for years, and in that time, something between us had shifted. I tried to brush off her late nights and the trips she claimed were for business, but deep down I knew. My whiskey was half gone when Jonathan made his way over, dragging Tracy with him like she was a prize to be paraded around. Jonathan Stewart, the man with too much money and not enough morals. I could already smell the alcohol on his breath before he got close. "Hey, loser," Jonathan sneered, tilting his glass toward me as if he was about to share a joke. "Enjoying the party?" I raised my glass, forcing a smile. "As much as I can." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. His eyes flicked over to Tracy, then back to me, glinting with something darker than mischief. "You know, I've been using your wife for years now." I froze, but outwardly I kept my calm, not giving him the reaction he clearly wanted. He leaned in closer, the smell of expensive whiskey overwhelming. "Better performance. She prefers my Johnson over yours." His voice was low, dripping with arrogance. I glanced at Tracy. Her eyes widened, filled with fear, her hand gripping her glass so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She looked away, unable to meet my gaze. I wanted to scream, to lash out, but instead I stayed quiet, my blood cold, my mind racing. Jonathan wasn't finished. He swirled his drink and smirked. "And those two kids of yours? They're mine too." Surprised, the words hit me like a punch to the gut. The room seemed to close in around me, the laughter and music fading into a dull hum. My grip tightened on the glass in my hand. I looked at Tracy, but she said nothing. She didn't deny it. I took a deep breath, and to my own surprise, I chuckled. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, more like disbelief. I stepped forward, just enough to make Jonathan falter for a split second. His smirk wavered. "Funny you say that," I said, voice low but steady. "Your wife's been telling me the same thing." Jonathan blinked, his face losing a bit of its color. I leaned in closer, just like he had done to me moments before. "Not gonna lie, I love the way she satisfies me in bed. She's told me quite a bit about you, Jonathan. Shared a lot of secrets." Tracy's eyes darted between us, panic rising on her face. Jonathan's grin evaporated completely. His cocky bravado turned into stunned silence. He glanced over his shoulder, almost instinctively, as if to see if anyone else had heard. His grip on Tracy's arm loosened. What did you just say?" Jonathan's voice cracked slightly, the confidence draining from him. I let the silence hang for a moment, letting the weight of my words sink in. Then, just as he was about to respond, the doors to the ballroom swung open with a loud thud. All heads turned toward the entrance. Jessica Stewart, Jonathan's wife, walked in, flanked by two police officers. She was calm, composed, and she wore a smile that mirrored the one Jonathan had flashed me just minutes earlier. Jonathan's eyes widened in disbelief. "Jess, what is this?" Jessica didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced at me, giving a small nod, and then fixed her gaze back on Jonathan. The two officers stepped forward. One of them spoke calmly. "Jonathan Stewart, we're placing you under arrest." The air in the room became thick with tension. People stopped talking. Faces turned pale as whispers filled the ballroom. Jonathan staggered back, his expression frozen between confusion and panic. "What the hell is going on?" His voice was louder now, desperate. Jessica's smile faded as she stepped toward him, her voice icy. "You're finished, Jonathan. The fraud, the embezzlement, all of it. We have everything." Tracy's hand shot to her mouth, a gasp escaping her lips. She turned to Jonathan, her eyes wide. "What are they talking about, John?" Jonathan stammered. "This is a mistake." I didn't. But his words were cut short as one of the officers grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back and snapping on the handcuffs. He struggled, trying to pull away, but there was no point. He was caught. "You set me up, Jess," he spat, fury taking over. "You can't do this." Jessica stepped even closer, her face inches from his. "You did this to yourself. And now, it's time you pay for it." Jonathan's defiance crumbled, his eyes darting around, searching for someone to help him. But no one moved. His colleagues stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Tracy stepped back, her face pale. She looked at me, but I gave her nothing. No sympathy, no comfort, just silence. Before Jonathan could say another word, I stepped up next to him, looking him dead in the eye. "You're both done," I said, my voice cold. "And this is only the beginning." The officers dragged Jonathan toward the door, his protests echoing through the room, but they fell on deaf ears. He had no power here anymore. As the doors closed behind them, the crowd slowly started to murmur, confusion and disbelief filling the room. Tracy stood alone now, staring at the ground, lost in the chaos of what had just unfolded. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off my chest. The beginning of the end had come, and I was ready for what came next. This was all planned by me and Jessica, 'cause we knew it hadn't always been like this. Tracy and I had been inseparable once, like any young couple who thought love could conquer everything. The mitten collège. She was the bright, lively girl who could captivate a room, and I was the guy lucky enough to catch her attention. We built a life together, married, bought a house, had kids, Emma and Jake. We were happy. At least, that's what I believed. But over the last few years, things changed. Slowly at first, subtle enough that I tried to ignore it. Tracy's late nights at work became more frequent. "Deadlines," she said. "Jonathan's a slave driver. I've got to stay and finish this project." I believed her, though I shouldn't have. There were more business trips with Jonathan, weekends away, midweek meetings out of town. And her phone? Always with her. Never left unattended, as if it were an extension of her hand. One night, she told me she'd be working late again. It was the third time that week. As she kissed me on the cheek and rushed out the door, I stood there for a moment, staring after her, a gnawing pit forming in my stomach. Something felt off, more than just the usual excuses. A voice in my head whispered things I didn't want to hear. "Check her phone." I shook my head, dismissing the thought, but it was persistent. I tried to ignore it, but by the time midnight rolled around and she still hadn't come home, I couldn't push it away anymore. My heart pounded in my chest as I went upstairs to the bedroom, her phone still plugged in on the nightstand. I hesitated for a long moment, staring at the screen. This was crossing a line. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, and I had to know. Unlocking her phone was easier than I expected. The passcode was our wedding date. I almost laughed at the irony. My hands shook as I navigated to her messages. I scrolled through the usual conversations with friends and family, but then there it was, Jonathan's name. I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I tapped on the thread. The first few messages were innocent enough. Work stuff, meetings, reports. Then I scrolled further, and my stomach dropped. The text quickly turned intimate, flirty, explicit. "Hey, sweetheart, last night was amazing. Can't wait to see you again. Meet me in the office. After the meeting, you're all I think about when I'm with him. Wish I could be with you instead." I scrolled faster, my heart racing. The further I went, the worse it got. Pictures, videos, things I could never unsee. It wasn't just sex, it was emotion attachment. She wasn't just having an affair. She was in love with him. I dropped the phone, stumbling back from the nightstand as if it had burned me. My mind was racing, spinning. My wife, the woman I'd built my life with, was betraying me. And not just with anyone, Jonathan. The man I had trusted as her boss, her mentor. Rage bubbled up inside me. But before I could fully process what I had seen, something else caught my eye. A document. I picked up the phone again, my fingers trembling. It was a paternity test, dated nearly 2 years ago. I felt the ground shift beneath me as I opened it. The test results were clear. Jonathan Stewart was the biological father of both Emma and Jake. The room spun. My legs gave out, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the phone in disbelief. My kids, our kids, weren't even mine. The betrayal wasn't just emotional. It was total. I had built my life around a lie. I don't know how long I sat there, numb and broken. Hours must have passed, the house silent except for the ticking of the clock. My mind bounced between heartbreak and anger, disbelief and rage. I thought about confronting Tracy the moment she walked through the door. I wanted to scream, to throw things, to demand answers. But then the anger hardened. A new kind of resolve formed. I couldn't just scream and throw things. I needed to do more. This wasn't something I could walk away from quietly. No, I needed to make sure they paid. And that's when I thought of her, Jessica, Jonathan's wife. She had always seemed quiet at the office parties, always standing off to the side, her eyes distant. But there had been moments when I caught her looking at Tracy and Jonathan, as if she knew something wasn't right. Maybe she suspected. Maybe she had known for longer than I had. I decided to reach out. I didn't want to do this alone. The next day, I sent Jessica an email. It was simple, just asked if she could meet for coffee, saying I had some questions about Jonathan and their recent business trips. I didn't reveal too much. Not yet. To my surprise, she agreed quickly. We met at a small cafe, far from the office, away from prying eyes. Jessica arrived first, sitting quietly at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. When I sat down, she didn't waste time with pleasantries. I know, she said, her voice calm but laced with sadness. About Tracy and Jonathan. I've known for a while. I was stunned. I hadn't expected her to be so open. Why didn't you say anything? Jessica looked out the window, her fingers tightening around the cup. What would it have changed? Jonathan's not the kind of man who lets go of what he wants easily. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't have proof. Until now. I showed her the texts, the pictures, the videos. Her face remained still, emotionless, but I saw her knuckles turn white as she gripped the edge of the table. We're going to make them pay, I said, my voice cold. Both of them. Jessica looked up at me, her eyes hard. What do you have in mind? And that's when we started planning. Every lie they'd told, every moment of deceit, would be used against them. We wouldn't just expose their affair. We'd destroy them. Completely. The next day, Jessica and I sat in a dimly lit corner of a small restaurant, the tension between us thick. We had been meeting in secret for weeks now, carefully planning every detail. Jessica, sharp and calculating, was done being a victim of Jonathan's abuse. She had been through enough, years of emotional torment, control, and even physical abuse, all in the name of keeping their children in a stable home. But this time, she was ready to bring him down. We need to be precise, Jessica said, her voice barely above a whisper. She leaned forward, her eyes focused. One wrong move, and they'll find a way to slip through. I nodded, my mind racing. We'll make sure that doesn't happen. We had laid the groundwork meticulously. Jessica had gathered everything she needed to expose Jonathan's illegal activities. She had access to his private files, his shady deals, and the money he had siphoned off from the company. Meanwhile, I had enough proof of the affair, messages, photos, and videos that would not only ruin their personal lives but tarnish their reputations forever. Are you sure about the office party? I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. It's risky. There will be too many people. Jessica smiled coldly. That's exactly why it's perfect. Public humiliation. We expose them in front of everyone who respects them. That's where it'll hurt the most. She was right. Jonathan thrived on his image, wealthy, powerful, in control. Exposing his affair with Tracy wasn't enough. He needed to lose everything. The same went for Tracy. She had built her life around lies, hiding behind her polished image. I wanted to see the cracks form in their perfect facade. We finalized the details as the night wore on. Jessica had already approached law enforcement about Jonathan's crimes, feeding them enough information to build a case without tipping him off. They'll be ready, she said. The police will have everything they need to make the arrest, but we need to time it perfectly. First, the humiliation, then the collapse. The plan was simple. We would start with the affair. The office party was the perfect stage. Jonathan surrounded by his colleagues and employees, all of whom saw him as an untouchable figure. Once the affair was exposed, Jessica would leak the financial documents to the authorities, leading to Jonathan's arrest on fraud and embezzlement charges. We need to make sure it all happens at once, I said, staring at the plan laid out before us. The affair, the arrest, it has to be one swift blow. Jessica leaned back in her chair, a small smirk on her face. That's the beauty of it. They won't see it coming. The night of the party arrived sooner than I expected. I walked in, dressed in my usual suit, but inside, my heart pounded with anticipation. Jessica was already there, dressed in a sleek black gown, playing her role as the perfect supportive wife. Jonathan had no idea what was coming. Tracy, too, was there, her smile radiant as she greeted colleagues and friends. She hadn't noticed me yet, but I stayed back, waiting for the right moment. As the evening wore on, Jonathan gave his usual speech, thanking his team for their hard work. He stood on the small stage in the center of the ballroom, a glass of champagne raised high. Tracy stood beside him, looking every bit the doting wife. My stomach churned at the sight. When Jonathan finished his speech and the crowd applauded, Jessica and I exchanged a glance. It was time. I made my way toward the stage, my heart thudding in my chest. Jonathan was still basking in the attention, soaking in the admiration of his employees. I stepped up to him, holding my drink loosely in one hand, a calm smile on my face. "Great speech, Jonathan," I said, keeping my tone casual. He turned to me, smirking. "Glad you enjoyed it. You should be proud of Tracy. She's been a real asset to the company." I chuckled softly, stepping closer. "Oh, I know she has." Tracy's face paled as she finally noticed me. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, I continued, my voice low enough that only the three of us could hear. "Did you enjoy those trips, Tracy?" I asked, locking eyes with her. "All those late nights?" Her eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. Jonathan frowned, confused by the sudden change in my tone. "What the hell are you talking about?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. I smiled. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, Jonathan. And tonight, everyone's going to find out." Before either of them could react, Jessica appeared beside me, holding up her phone. On the screen was a series of explicit messages between Jonathan and Tracy, their affair laid bare for anyone to see. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as Jessica projected the messages onto a large screen behind the stage. Jonathan's face went white. Tracy looked like she was about to faint. "You son of a bitch," Jonathan started, but before he could finish, Jessica cut him off. "Oh, I'm not done," she said, her voice icy. "You see, it's not just your personal life that's falling apart. I've got enough evidence to bury you. The fraud, the embezzlement, the offshore accounts, I've got it all." The color drained from Jonathan's face as he realized what was happening. He took a step toward Jessica, but the ballroom doors swung open, and in walked two police officers. The room fell silent as they approached Jonathan. One of the officers spoke firmly. "Jonathan Stewart, you're under arrest for fraud and embezzlement." Jonathan's eyes darted around the room, searching for some way out, but there was none. The officers handcuffed him, and as they led him away, the room erupted in whispers. His colleagues, who had once admired him, now looked on in shock and disgust. Tracy, still frozen in place, finally met my eyes. I said nothing, just watched as her world crumbled around her. She tried to speak, to explain, but no words came out. Jessica turned to me, her expression unreadable. "It's over." I nodded. "And now the real consequences begin." The moment the police officers clicked the handcuffs around Jonathan's wrists, the room seemed to freeze. Whispers cut through the silence like knives, and Jonathan's face, once smug and arrogant, twisted with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "What the hell is this?" he barked, jerking his arms against the cuffs. His eyes darted from the officers to Jessica, then to me. "You think you could do this to me? I'll have your jobs. Do you know who I am?" Jessica, standing by the officers, met his outburst with nothing but cold indifference. Calmly, she handed the files she had prepared to the lead detective. "These documents contain all the evidence you need: bank statements, transaction histories, offshore accounts. Everything you'll need to prove Jonathan's crimes." The detective nodded, giving Jonathan a hard look. "Jonathan Stewart, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Jonathan cut him off, snarling, "I'm not some common criminal. This is a setup. Do you hear me? I'll ruin you all." As the detective continued reading Jonathan his rights, the reality of the situation seemed to hit him. He stopped struggling, his face turning pale as he glanced around the room. His colleagues, people who had once feared and admired him, stood in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. Some had their phones out, likely recording the spectacle. Jonathan's carefully built empire was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to Tracy. She had been standing motionless, her face drained of color, her eyes wide with fear. The tears that had been welling up finally began to fall as she looked at me, her lips trembling. "David," she whispered, stepping toward me, her hand reaching out as if to touch my arm. "Please, I can explain. I didn't want to hurt you." I took a step back, my expression hardening. "Explain?" I scoffed. "Explain what, Tracy? That you've been sleeping with your boss for years? That our children aren't even mine?" My voice was low, filled with a controlled fury that I hadn't allowed to surface until now. "You lied to me, over and over again. You used me, just like Jonathan used you." Tracy shook her head, her tears coming faster. "It wasn't like that. I never meant for any of this to happen. Please, David, I'm sorry. We can fix this." "We can fix this?" I interrupted, laughing bitterly. "There's nothing to fix, Tracy. You made your choices, and now you get to live with them." She was silent for a moment, her chest heaving with sobs as she tried to find the words. "But the kids, David, we can work something out for their sake. They still need you." I cut her off again, my voice now cold and final. "The kids," I said, shaking my head. "Those are my children, Tracy. You made sure of that when you lied to me about their father. And don't pretend you care about their future now. You didn't care when you were sneaking around with Jonathan behind my back." Her face crumpled, and she fell to her knees, her hands covering her face as she sobbed openly. I watched her for a moment, feeling an odd sense of detachment. The woman I had loved, the life I thought we had built together, it was all a lie. And now I was watching that lie unravel right in front of me. Behind us, the detectives were leading Jonathan toward the door. He struggled against the officers, his voice hoarse as he shouted threats over his shoulder. "You think this is over? You think you can ruin me? I'll be back. You hear me? I'll destroy all of you." But his threats fell on deaf ears. The room was filled with a sense of finality, as if everyone knew Jonathan's reign was over for good. The doors swung open, and the police led him out into the night, leaving nothing but a stunned silence in their wake. As the door closed behind them, Jessica and I exchanged a glance. There was no need for words. We had done what we set out to do. Jonathan's power had crumbled, his lies exposed for the world to see. And now, it was Tracy's turn to face the consequences of her betrayal. Jessica stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "I've already spoken to my lawyer," she said, addressing both me and the remaining crowd. "The divorce papers are being drawn up, and full custody of the children will be mine. Jonathan won't have any rights over them once the legal process is complete." Tracy looked up from the floor, her eyes red and swollen. "Jessica, please," she begged. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Jessica's expression didn't change. "You didn't care about anyone but yourself, Tracy. You betrayed your husband. You lied to everyone. You deserve everything that's coming." Tracy didn't respond. She simply sat there, sobbing quietly, as the weight of everything she had done finally crashed down on her. I stood there for a moment, watching her fall apart, but I felt nothing. No pity, no sympathy, just relief. I turned to Jessica and nodded. "It's over." Jessica gave a small nod in return. "Yes, it is." The party was over. The crowd began to disperse, whispering amongst themselves as they processed everything they had just witnessed. I walked out into the cool night air, the weight that had been pressing on me for months finally lifting. Jessica walked beside me, silent but resolute. We had set things in motion, and now there was no turning back. As we reached the parking lot, Jessica turned to me. "What now?" I shrugged, feeling the first taste of freedom. "Now we move on." She smiled faintly, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of peace. The nightmare was over. The people who had betrayed us were going to pay for their sins, and we were finally free to start fresh. As we drove away from the scene of their downfall, I couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, and this time, it was on our terms. The weeks that followed the party were a whirlwind of chaos for Jonathan and Tracy. Jonathan's arrest hit the news like a tidal wave. Headlines screamed about his fall from grace, how the once powerful CEO had been caught in a web of fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal. His face was splashed across every news outlet, a symbol of corporate greed and personal failure. The scandal rocked his company to its core. Stock prices plummeted, and in a matter of days, Jonathan was ousted from the board. The empire he had built, the image of invincibility he had so carefully crafted, crumbled before his eyes. Jessica and I watched it unfold with a grim satisfaction. There was no glee in seeing a man's life destroyed, but there was justice. Jonathan had spent years manipulating people, exploiting their weaknesses, and now he was paying the price. His legal battles were swift, the evidence Jessica and I had provided airtight. It wasn't long before he was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The judge, cold and stern, sentenced him to a decade behind bars, with no possibility of early release. As the gavel hit, it felt like a final punctuation mark on Jonathan's reign of terror. Tracy, on the other hand, was left in a state of shock. Her affair with Jonathan had come to light in the most public and humiliating way possible. Her colleagues turned their backs on her, and she was forced to resign from her job. She had been a rising star in the company, but now she was nothing more than a footnote in Jonathan's scandal. Her reputation was ruined, her career over before it had really begun. I filed for divorce the morning after the party. It was quick and clinical. I didn't want to drag things out, and neither did she. There wasn't much to argue about. Tracy had no leverage. I had the evidence of her affair, the knowledge of her deception, and the will to see it through. The divorce went through within weeks, and I fought for full custody of Emma and Jake. It wasn't easy, especially knowing the truth about their parentage, but I wasn't going to let them suffer for Tracy's mistakes. In court, Tracy tried to plead her case, tears streaming down her face as she begged for joint custody. "David, please, the kids need their mother," she sobbed, her voice cracking. "I made mistakes, but I love them. They're my whole world." I stared at her, feeling a strange detachment. The love I had once felt for her was gone, replaced by something cold and unrecognizable. "You had your chance, Tracy," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "You chose Jonathan over your family. You lied to me for years. You don't get to play the victim now." The judge was sympathetic to my case. Given the nature of the affair and the impact it had on our family, she granted me full custody. Tracy was devastated, but there was nothing she could do. She had destroyed our marriage, our trust, and now she was paying the price. The kids had questions, of course. Emma and Jake were too young to fully understand what had happened, but they knew something was wrong. "Why isn't Mommy living with us anymore?" Emma asked one night as I tucked her into bed. Her big, innocent eyes searched mine for answers I wasn't sure how to give. I knelt by her bed, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Mommy made some bad choices, sweetheart," I said gently. "But I love you, and I'm going to take care of you. Always." Jake, younger and more confused, simply clung to my leg whenever I picked him up from school. He didn't have the words to ask what was happening, but I could see the fear in his eyes. It broke my heart, but I was determined to be the father they needed. I might not have been their biological dad, but I had been there for every scraped knee, every bedtime story, every tear and laugh. Jonathan might have been their father by blood, but he would never be their dad. That was my role, and I was going to hold on to it with everything I had. As Tracy faded from our lives, Jessica and I grew closer. What had started as a partnership for revenge became something deeper. We spent more time together, talking not just about Jonathan and Tracy, but about our children, our hopes, our fears. We bonded over the wreckage of our broken marriages, sharing stories of pain, but also of resilience. Jessica had her own scars from Jonathan's emotional abuse, and together we helped each other heal. Our kids, too, became fast friends. Emma and Jake adored Jessica's children, and soon our two families were blending in ways I hadn't anticipated. Dinners were loud and chaotic, filled with laughter and the sounds of children running through the house. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. It wasn't long before Jessica and I made the decision to move in together. We had both lost so much, but in each other, we found something worth rebuilding. Our relationship wasn't rushed or forced. It grew naturally, out of respect and mutual care. We knew what we had been through, and we weren't looking for quick fixes. But in time, something more than friendship blossomed between us. One night, as we sat on the porch after putting the kids to bed, Jessica turned to me, her eyes soft in the fading light. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if none of this had come to light? If we never found out about them?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "I try not to. What's done is done. We can't change the past, but we can make sure the future is better, for us and for the kids." She smiled, reaching for my hand. "Here's to the future, then." We clinked our glasses, the night settling peacefully around us. Despite everything, there was finally light in our lives again. The storm had passed, and now we were free to start anew. Years passed, and with time, the wounds that had once cut deep began to heal. Life, as it often does, found a rhythm. Jessica and I had built something that neither of us could have imagined when our lives were torn apart by betrayal. We weren't just surviving, we were thriving. On a Saturday morning, I sat on the porch of the home Jessica and I had made together. The kids were playing in the yard, their laughter carrying through the warm air. Emma was pushing Jessica's youngest, Sophie, on the swing, while Jake and Jessica's son, Lucas, played with a soccer ball on the grass. Watching them, you'd never guess the chaos that had once surrounded us. They were just kids being kids, happy and carefree, untouched by the storm that had nearly shattered everything. Jessica stepped out onto the porch, handing me a cup of coffee before settling into the chair beside me. "Looks like they're having fun," she said, nodding toward the children. I smiled, taking a sip of the coffee. "Yeah, they are. It's amazing how resilient they've been through all of this." Jessica leaned back in her chair, her gaze following the kids as they ran around the yard. "They've had us, David. We made sure they felt safe, no matter what happened." She was right. We had worked hard to shield them from the fallout of Jonathan and Tracy's lies. Therapy, patience, and a lot of love had helped them rebuild their sense of security. Emma and Jake, once confused and hurt, had blossomed in this new life. They didn't ask about Tracy much anymore, and when they did, I gave them the truth in pieces they could handle. As for Jonathan, he was a distant memory, just a man behind bars, a father in name only. Jessica turned to me, her hand resting on mine. "Can you believe it's been 4 years since everything happened? Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago, and other times it feels like yesterday," I said. The memory of that office party, the confrontation, Jonathan being led away in handcuffs, it was all still so vivid in my mind. "And Tracy?" Jessica asked carefully, though we both knew the answer. "Tracy?" I paused, watching the way the sunlight danced through the trees, casting shadows across the lawn. "She's still trying to put her life back together. Last I heard, she moved out of town. She's alone. No job, no family. I don't think she ever really recovered from losing the kids." Tracy had reached out a few times in the early days after the divorce, pleading for forgiveness, asking to see the children. But I had made it clear that there was no going back. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. I wasn't bitter anymore. That had faded with time. But there was no place for her in the life Jessica and I had built. As for Jonathan, his fate was sealed. The evidence Jessica and I had gathered was more than enough to put him away for a long time. He had been convicted on multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. The judge had been harsh, giving him no leniency. He was now a forgotten figure in the prison system, left with nothing but bitterness and anger. The powerful man who had once strutted around with arrogance was now just another inmate. Jessica and I had taken something from both of them, but in doing so, we had found something greater, each other. Do you ever think about them? Jessica asked, her voice soft. Not much anymore, I admitted. Maybe in the beginning I did, but now this is my life. You and the kids. That's what matters. She smiled, a quiet, content smile that always warmed my heart. I'm glad. We've been through a lot, but I wouldn't change a thing. I'm happy. Really happy. And the kids are too, I added, watching them chase each other across the yard, the sound of their laughter filling the air. We sat in silence for a while, just enjoying the peacefulness of the morning. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that had once filled our lives. The bitterness, the betrayal, it was all behind us now. In its place was something simple and pure, a family, a new beginning. At one point, Jake ran up to us, panting with excitement. Dad, Mom, can we have a picnic later? Jessica grinned, ruffling his hair. Of course, kiddo. How about we make sandwiches and take them down to the lake? Yeah, Jake yelled, turning to the other kids. We're going to the lake for a picnic. As he sprinted back to them, I turned to Jessica with a smirk. Looks like we got our day planned. She laughed. Guess so. We watched the kids for a little longer, content in the quiet happiness we had found. It was strange to think how much our lives had changed. For years ago, we were both trapped in marriages built on lies, lost in a sea of betrayal and hurt. But now we were free. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like everything was exactly as it should be. Later that day, we packed up a basket with sandwiches, snacks, and drinks. The kids buzzed with excitement as we loaded everything into the car and headed to the lake. The sun was shining, the sky clear, and it felt like the perfect day for a fresh start. A continuation of the life we were building, free from the ghosts of the past. As we spread out the picnic blanket by the water, I looked around at Jessica and the kids, feeling a wave of gratitude. I had once thought that betrayal had broken me, that my life would never recover from the pain. But here I was, surrounded by love, happiness, and a future that felt brighter than I had ever imagined. Jessica caught my eye and smiled. To new beginnings, she said, raising her bottle of soda in a mock toast. I clinked mine against hers. To new beginnings. And as we sat by the lake, watching the kids play in the water, I knew there was no going back. The past was behind us, and the future was ours to create. Together.